I want to say that every painting has a humble beginning. For example, these two red poppy paintings I finished recently, they didn't look like much at first. If anything, they looked kind of abstract. But would you believe me if I told you at one point, they kind of look like this? That is because these two paintings also started as acrylic paintings. And then I painted oil on top. Hello and welcome. My name is Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. And today, I'm going to talk to you about the benefits of doing a underpainting in acrylic. But before we get started, I want to point out something very, very important. That is, you could paint oil on top of acrylic, but do not do acrylic over oil, unless you want your paintings to fall apart very quickly. Yes, these two paintings are definitely in oil, but they started off as acrylic underpaintings. Kind of like this one right here, which I'm currently working on. As you can see, this photo right here. Being able to do oil on top of acrylic is something I've known for a very long time. Practically since I was at Mica. But what I knew, I never actually put into practice. Until very recently. Why? Well, I started to do paintings in acrylic, and as much as I still hate the medium, I can appreciate its dry time. It is a lot faster than oil, but I have to say between acrylic and oil is still my preferred medium. There are still, in my opinion, more pros than cons with it. For example, there's certain very delicate touches you could only achieve with the slow drying time, but again, oil is slow. Yes, I could use something like Japanese dryer, but from my understanding, you run some risks of the paint cracking. And since acrylic is a lot faster than oil in terms of drying time, I figured, why not do the underpainting in acrylic and lay out foundations of bodies of paint and lines that will help me work out the composition. The drying time gave me an advantage of being able to fix mistakes on the spot. Again, the dry time. And I figured later, if I want to go into detail, oil is definitely the way to go. Anyhow, let me show you some time-lapse videos of how I did these two paintings, beginning with this one first. One of the first things I do is paint where the poppies go. Something noteworthy to mention is I use red. I wouldn't find out until later that was a big mistake because in the end they were not vibrant enough. That is why in the second video you'll see I use orange instead. It is pretty rare for me to paint the subject matter first, but I thought it was important in this scenario. The poppies are going to be the stars after all. But as you can see, I'm not going too much into detail. After that, I start to paint more traditionally. I start to paint the sky. It was definitely cloudy that day, so I lay out a more muted blue. Then I start applying colors for the background. There are definitely trees covering most of it, but it was important to lay out the foundation of what I see behind them. And plus, since acrylic does dry very quickly, I can paint over the background in a matter of minutes. But on the left side, it's only trees. So I lay out some dark greens to cover that area. I gridded the photo and the canvas in a way to help me lay out the composition a lot quicker. I'm not going into too much detail with the trees just yet, but I'm trying to establish where they are going to be. Now I begin to focus on the foreground, and I try to use some distinctive colors to separate the hills in the terrain. I took the photo on top of a small hill, so the goal was to, in a way, create an illusion of looking down a bit. Most of the area was grassy, but I definitely painted areas a different color where there was either no or very little grass, plus some darker tones where there was some shade. Again, I'm not going into detail. Think of this as prep work for the oil that's going to go on top. Though I already applied some muted blue for the sky, I start painting the clouds. While I am doing this, I'm also reshaping the trees, as well as the terrain in the background. In a way, I'm correcting the composition, and I can be thankful for the dry time of acrylic. Even though it's a cloudy day, some blue from the sky is visible in certain areas. In order for the sky to be distinguishable, this time the blue is a little brighter. I also took advantage of the acrylic still being wet to dry brush it a bit. Yes, this is going to be easier with oil, but the paint was still wet, so I said to myself, why not? Now I'm beginning to make the terrain more distinguishable. I'm applying more different colors that I see as the underpainting in order in a way to act as a guide when I apply the oil on top. These are fields actually where farmers plant stuff. I'm also starting to shape out the trees in the background. I'm applying some darks as well as some lights in order to give the trees some shape and form. For the most part, the ones on the left barely had branches visible, but at the same time, since they were in the distance, the goal was not to get too detailed, but instead to create an illusion of leaves. But the lights and darks are very important because that's how they're gonna have shape and form and a sense of volume. While some of the trees were very dense, where you couldn't see the sky, there were parts where the branches were visible and there were less leaves. I tried to distinguish these areas by painting the sky, as well as adding some branches here and there. Besides trees, there were also a few bushes, and just like the trees, I used lights and darks in order to create a sense of volume and shape them out, kinda like a sculptor. But for sure, the tree on the very right was definitely the most difficult to do. This tree had more visible branches, and you could see parts of the sky as well as the background between the branches and leaves. Instead of focusing on detail, I paint the skeleton of the tree, starting with the main branches and then painting some of the leaves, but focusing more on the clusters that are dense. But this whole time, I'm mindful of the sky in the back as well as some of the terrain. Some of it has to remain visible. If you notice to the left, there's a smaller tree. I only painted 2 main branches for that one. Not because it was more simple, but because there were way more leaves covering it. Now for the foreground. It is made mostly of grass, wild plants, and of course, red poppies. The first step was to lay out the lights and darks for the terrain. These bodies of color in a way will act as a guide when I apply oil. I did paint some other flowers besides the poppies, as well as the impression of some grass blades, but nothing too detailed. In some ways, I was trying to get a feel on how I will paint the grass. With acrylic, in a way, I can practice, and if I make a mistake, I could just paint right over it. Though I said I'm not going to go into too much detail, I wanted to be accurate to an extent, therefore I tried to paint as many of the wild flowers as I saw in the correct spot. I knew if I needed to, I could improvise with oil, but I figured the more I put in the right spot, I will be more confident when I use oil, and it will allow me to focus more on detailing the flowers later and not worrying if they're in the wrong spot. That is why I only used solid colors like red or white. The detailing will come later with oil. Something I want to point out from doing an acrylic underpainting for the first time, it's that if you want reds to be vibrant, don't use red, use orange or yellow, and you will see in the next painting demonstration what I mean. Now let's talk about how I did this one here. I start off again by painting the poppies, but this time I use yellow. I will go to orange eventually, but at the beginning stages I had the thought that maybe some yellow might work out better. Just like the previous painting, I knew the poppies were going to be the stars. There are less plants in this composition, but because it's up close, they are all way more detailed. Everything from the stems, the leaves, and the different life stages of a poppy, plus the thorns. As beautiful as these flowers are, they have tiny little thorns. There are definitely some hills in the background, but I thought it'd be very important to lay out where all the plants were first, because in the end, the hills in the back are going to be very blurry. Now time to paint the sky, or at least a portion of it. Unlike the previous painting, the sky is way more complex this time, but this is the underpainting only. So the goal is not really to detail the clouds, just to lay out the right colors in the right spot, which are some blues and whites of different tones. For sure, this is where oil excels, dry brushing, because like I said before in many videos, painting with acrylic is like playing the violin with a saw, or like one of my watchers mentioned, a chainsaw. Also, if you notice, I'm not too concerned about painting over the stems and flowers I already painted. I added some water to the acrylic, so it is thin and in a way see-through, but I'm being very careful not to touch the yellow as much as possible. Whatever is yellow or orange in the end is going to be the most vibrant part of the painting. Plus, this is only the underpainting again. When the oil goes on top, it will be more refined, and I definitely will paint more carefully. Now it is time to paint the background in the bottom. There are some different tones of whites and blues that I am trying to depict. They are not accurate to the photo, just an estimation. But while I am painting the background, I'm also correcting some of the flowers and the overall composition. Even though the hills are blurry in the background, there are different tones of green, mostly on the dark, neutral, warm side. But one thing I did exclude from the photo are some of the fields that are visible. They were too bright and they would have been a distraction to the overall composition, and I figured more dark would be better to make the red poppies pop out. Like before, I'm not too concerned if I paint over the stems. I figured once the paint dries, I can repaint the stems. But like before, I'm being very careful about not touching the yellow too much. As for the trees that are kind of visible on the top of the hill, I did try to depict a few notable ones, but I think towards the end, I was more concerned about blurring them during the oil stage than making them stand out. When doing the clouds, instead of focusing on detail, instead I used lights and darks in order to shape out the clouds and give them a sense of volume and form. It's all based on how the sun hits them. I'm also repainting parts of the sky to reshape them as well. I'm setting myself up for the oil that will go on top. Right now, the placement and composition is more important than detail. Now back to the bottom of the background. As you can see, I initially intended to paint the field on the far right, but decided against it in the end. But while I'm painting the hills in the background, I am in a way correcting the poppies and other plants. I'm starting to also use darker greens as well in order to help define the hills a bit. They aren't cardboard cutouts after all. They are 3D and have volume and mass. As for the clouds that were hovering over the hills, there was an interesting light violet underneath them. I tried to apply the same color also to the rest of the clouds. It is definitely more pronounced during the underpainting, but later when I apply oil, it won't be as visible, but there will be tones of it coming from underneath. But right now, it's all about sculpting, not finesse. Speaking about finesse, though I'm not trying to get into too much detail, I am trying to refine and add as many plants as possible. This way, when I start doing the oil on top, it will be more reassuring to know everything is in the right place. Of course, I will make some minor corrections, but in a way, the goal for a underpainting is to set yourself up for success. When I initially looked at the photo, one of the goals I had was to capture the uniqueness of each plant. Some had some interesting bends, and a lot of them were not even straight. I used bold, simple colors to try to capture those unique features. I felt it would add to the realism of these poppies and plants being wildflowers after all. But in the end, these are all just part of the supporting cast of the main stars, which are the hills in the background. Just kidding, it's the poppies. Speaking about them, I'm going back into them with orange. And if you want to know, both the yellow and the orange I use are cadmium. That is the way you want to go if you truly want bright colors, especially for red, yellow, and orange. Anyhow, I'm not just applying a coat of orange to these flowers, I'm also reshaping them and making them more defined. In some cases, I'm trying to make some of the petals more distinguishable, but the ultimate goal is for them to be more vibrant in the end when I switch to oils for the finish. While repainting the poppies, I am trying to be careful as well as accurate, especially when it comes to the plants that are in front of them as well as behind. Another goal is to create a sense of depth and distance, and the way the plants and poppies line up from front to back will help establish that. Especially this really big one that is closest to the viewer. There's definitely a lot of detail like water drops and tiny folds, but I'm not too worried about capturing those details in the underpainting. In a way, I'm thinking they will be meaningless in the end if the poppies are not vibrant enough. If you made it to the end, thanks for watching. I truly appreciate it. And if you're an oil painter, consider doing a acrylic underpainting. And if you paint in oils, take it in consideration to try acrylic as an underpainting. You might actually appreciate it for what it's worth, which is the fast drying time, of course. Anyhow, once again, my name is Charlambos. I go by Bob, and I'm not your typical painter. Until next time, bye for now.